it is the final bit, and I want to focus on, well, I want to end on the promise that we will make to donors. But before we get there, we will be building on all of these light bulb moments. Before we get there, I wanted to go back to this image that I showed you earlier. And I think this is, for me, as I kind of, enter my twilight years, I'm increasingly thinking about people like that and fearful that coming into this sector can be disillusioning. And one of the, for me, the worst effects of the crisis was the number of good people who left fundraising because they didn't think it was where they wanted to be. And I really think that you can make a difference in fundraising. This is not the best paid job in the world. You probably worked that out a long time ago. But it can be one of the most rewarding, and I don't feel we make enough of it. So I wanted to take you back in time. I've taken you to the north of Scotland twice already. That's because I come from there. But this is, I want to take you to North Yorkshire Moors, which is another part of the UK, which is quite wild and not very heavily populated and really quite beautiful. And I want to tell you a true story about an event that I was giving to show you how long ago this was. It was in the early 1980s. And with my colleague George Smith, I was running an event called Direct Mail, The Last Fundraising Frontier. And it was because direct mail was almost unknown in the UK, and we were trying to persuade people that maybe they should look more closely at this unexplored medium. And there was a guy standing at the back at the end of the events, and there was a queue of people who wanted more information and were leaving their business cards and things like that. And I saw this guy, and he was quite nervous and quite shy. And he said to me, "You've never heard of an organization like my organization. We've never done any fundraising. We're completely new to it, but we need to do something because the organization is under threat." And this was very early in my advertising agency days, and he caught me on a weak moment. So he said, "I want you to come up to North Yorkshire and see this place." Because he says, "I know when you see the place, it will transform what you think about it. And I think if you don't see the place, you'll say no to me. But I think if you come up..." And the trouble was, I didn't have a quick enough excuse to give him to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, haven't got a window for that." So the following Tuesday, I found myself at King's Cross heading up to North Yorkshire. And I found an amazing place. This is an organization called Botton Village. And it is a village, it follows the teachings of Rudolf Steiner. It's a village for adults with mental handicap, where the villagers work alongside co-workers in a community where everybody has a part to play. And so they live in the community. But when I got there, I found a village that was in decline. It had serious problems. Now you have to realize that this is the time of Margaret Thatcher. Do you remember her? Dreadful woman who had this notion that people should stand on their own 2 feet. So she was actually rolling back state provision. She was taking away funding from organizations like Botton Village. And at the same time, they were facing new regulations that were saying things like people should have their own room, whereas in their case, they shared rooms, friends had shared rooms together. And so they had to upgrade their facilities at a time when their funding was being reduced. And they said, "We simply can't go on." And it was a bit like putting their daughter on the streets, to go fundraising. It was something that was completely alien to their culture. And so I got to Botton Village, and it looked like this. The roofs were leaking, the place was falling apart, and I met the wonderful people that lived there, but they were really, really in difficulty. And so they were talking to me about starting fundraising. And I told them that there was no guarantee of success, that adults with a mental handicap was rather a difficult proposition. And the thing that knocked me sideways and made me rethink that I really wanted to do this was that one of them said, these people are going to be doing so much for us. What can we do for them? And I thought, well, you know, wow, I'm not used to that. You know, it's all about you give, we take, you know. This was somebody who was saying, what can we do for our donors? So that was that 90-degree shift of perspective. And I just thought, and this was very early in my career, to me that planted the seed of relationship fundraising and thinking about what we do from a slightly different perspective. And what we did was we set about writing personal letters to people. This is just one of them. It's from a woman called Frances. She's saying, if it wasn't for Botton, I would have to live on my own somewhere without my friends. It was quite emotional copy, quite simple, you know, single color, black and white. But they did something which was remarkable. And the idea came from the fact that they'd invited me to come and see the place. And they'd said to me, once you see the place, you'll never feel the same about it again. And I'd found it was true. So I said, why don't we invite all of the people that we're sending the direct mail appeals to come and visit us? Because nobody had ever heard of Botton Village, you know. And I said, that will show people that we're open and we can be trusted. And they said, but we're sending this to 40,000 people. You know, what's going to happen if they all come and visit? And I said, no, direct mail doesn't work like that. You know, you don't get 100% response. But if only I'd known. I mean, if I tell you that in Botton Village, not long after that conversation, one of the villagers was appointed to look after visitors who did come to Botton Village. And they used to get coach parties of donors coming up to Botton Village and visiting it. And when they did that, those people, when they arrived, they were Botton villagers for life because they saw what a very special place this was. So I used to go up to Botton Village now every year. For donkey's years, 30 years or so, that I've been involved with Botton Village. What's special about them for me is that they're one of only 2 organizations in my experience who have ever said to me, we've met all our needs, we've more than met all our needs, we don't need to raise money anymore. And that was when legacies started to kick in for Botton Village, and really they couldn't spend the money in the village. What they did was they extended it to other communities of adults with mental handicaps. And so they introduced their particular philosophy of donor-focused fundraising to other similar organizations. But what I used to like about the visit that I made to Botton, that was what they were saying. If these people are giving so generously to help us, what can we do for them? And that inspired a whole change in philosophy. This is the kind of household that you might see up at Botton Village. This is one of the community houses. It's restored to such a fabulous standard because Botton has the money provided by its generous donors, and it can provide really excellent living accommodation. Some of them are purpose-built. Some of them are old converted farm buildings, but many now are purpose-built, and they are really special. They are fantastic, and they're fabulous places to live. And in the village there are workshops. It's kind of lovely old-fashioned touchy-feely, like Geppetto's woodwork shops. There's a candle shop, and there's a glassware shop, and there's a bakery, and there's all these, you know, fantastic places full of these beaming, happy, inspirational people. There's no misery at Botton Village. One of the things that we found was we produced a magazine for them, which was called Botton Village Life. And it was just a 4-page newsletter to send out to donors. And we interviewed characters from the village. And there was a guy called Peter Street. And Peter Street, because he had a mental handicap, he spoke in a particular way. And we recorded that. Our writer wrote that down, and it was sent into our editorial department where they rewrote it into proper English. And what they did was they sanitized it, and they removed the character of Peter Street. So we had to put it right back into the language of Peter Street, and it taught us a lesson about being real. And, you know, I think that the people who worked in my agency learned as much about fundraising from Botton as Botton learned from them. You walk around the village now, you will see the award-winning church that the donors' funds have provided. You will see, this looks like something out of The Hobbit, you know, you know, it really does. And this was on a particularly hobbitish day. So Gandalf would appear from one end. And, you know, this is their community hall. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. So really, really successful. But what's different about this, and this is from an article written by Howard Lake, who runs the UK fundraising website, and it's talking about the fundraising preference service that the new fundraising regulator, Post-Olive Cook, was imposing upon British charities. And he wrote this article saying, a 30-year-old version of the fundraising preference service. And he's absolutely right. This is the reply form. I'm sorry it's slightly out of focus because it's rather an old, I don't know why it should be out of focus because it's old. Because I feel I'm out of focus at times. But what's really special about this is in the headline. The traditional fundraising reply form, this is the back of a reply form which is personalized on the other side, says 7 ways Botton Village can help you. Normally, it would say 7 ways you can help Botton Village. And that is a fundamental characteristic of the culture of Botton Village. So this was the thing that caused an outrage at the Institute of Fundraising. Point 7 is we will only send you information if you want it. You could tick a box saying, I would prefer you not to write to me again. This is giving donors appropriate choices. You can choose the number of times you hear from them. You can choose what you hear about. You can hear about making a will and other things. You can introduce friends. You know, there's all sorts of things that you can do. This was a radical departure. And Botton Village did it because they thought it was the right thing to do. So 30 years of giving donors choices actually produced 30 years of fundraising results to die for. I have worked for hundreds of charities. I have never known an organization as successful as Botton Village in simple percentage response terms consistently. They built up a donor file of over 90,000 people who would, when surveyed, would say things like, the last cause I would remove from my charities I support would be Botton Village. They consistently got very nearly 25%. This is an aggregate. This is quite out of date, this slide, but consistently their large donors produced something 43% response, donors 24% response, multiple donors. Now, this is a well-maintained list. Their data management was impeccable. But we offered one group of people to just hear from the charity at Christmas time, and that group never got less than 50%. We always got more than half of the response. We actually got more from that segment by writing to them once a year than we got when we wrote to them 5 times a year, and we saved postage and print on all of those packs that we were sending to them. And there was a group of people who were allowed the chance to choose just to receive information, no appeals, so they were sent no reply form, and they still responded at 14%, which is better than many warm lists of bigger charities. Now, the reason that I'm telling you about this is I want to introduce you to an Australian, actually he's an American who lives in Australia. He is called Derek Glass, and he posts critical comments on websites, always attacking fundraising. And he wrote a comment on the Botton Village case history. And I'll just read you a bit of it. The so-called Botton Farm case study has always been a myth. The practice of letting donors opt out of mailings has never been tested against a control group. No controlled testing of any kind has ever been conducted to prove the strategy works at all. The entire strategy has always been based on blind faith. The claim that donations seemingly went up after the strategy was implemented is a perfect example of that. I actually don't know where he got that from, but never mind. In other words, no tests, no controls were ever used. That's because it doesn't actually work, and that's why virtually no other charity follows this fundraising model. It's a utopian myth. Now, the point of this is that Derek is right. But he's only right in a little bit. And that little bit is very important that fundraisers understand. And in the rest of what he's saying, I think he couldn't be more wrong. What is right is that the mailing has never been tested against a control group. And there's a singular and very good reason why that is. Fundraising 101, best practice in direct mail fundraising would say, of course, you have to test against a control group. So you give one control group version A, and you give the other something different. And Botton Village wouldn't tolerate that because they said, we think it's right to give people choices. Why would we test a group of people who don't get the choice and see whether we get more from one or B? It doesn't matter to us. Botton's fundraisers believed that giving donors choices was the right thing to do back in the 1980s. If something is right for our donors, if it's the right thing to do, why would we want to test it to give some donors the wrong thing? Just to see that there's another way we could raise a bit more money is not a good enough answer. I really believe our sector needs to accept this and change. We should not be testing doing the wrong thing on our supporters to see if it will add a 0.1% incremental increase. At all times, I believe integrity should underpin what we do and not just what generates the most cash. And I think it's really important that that message gets across. The reason that lots of people are now doing things very similar to what Botton was doing 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. No other charity has properly tried this because it's counterintuitive and it's quite expensive to administer. Now the fundraising regulator is pushing us to do things like this. And what Botton Village does is with every communication it sends to its supporters, it offers them the opportunity to opt out and the opportunity to change their preferences for less or more or different types of communication. And as I said, this was the outcome of Botton's fundraising adventure that led from that strange train journey all those years ago. We no longer need to fundraise. The village was more than self-sufficient. And I think that's what fundraising is all about. So the story is told on Sophie, and this comes from Sophie's view, which is where Sophie adds a critique. And it says, Botton Village was a pioneer of relationship fundraising. Its whole philosophy has always been, and continues to be, based on the idea of respected friends who have choice and control about the relationship they have with the charity and the communications they receive. And Botton was very rigorous about this. They would not allow their donors to be exploited in any way. They were very reluctant to do anything like treating major donors better than others. They wanted all donors, however much or however little they gave, to get the same reaction. So this story's been under our noses for 30 years. It's time our sector developed the capacity to... I've probably presented this. I wouldn't like to count how many times I've presented that story to an audience of fundraisers like you, and I sort of wonder why I'm still doing it. This is where we need to listen, learn, or leave, whatever that Latin inscription that Rainier found